to taxes. The government levies taxes on many goods and services to raise revenue to pay for national defense, public schools, police, and parks. The government can make buyers or sellers pay the tax. Taxes come in two forms, either as a percentage of the goods price or a specific amount on each unit sold. We are going to analyze per unit taxes, which is a specific amount on each unit sold. Suppose we are analyzing the market for pizza. Prices on the vertical axis and quantities on the horizontal. Supply is upward sloping and demand is downward sloping. Equilibrium without the tax occurs at $10 and 500 units. Let's suppose the government levies a tax on buyers of $1.50 per unit. Buyers will have to pay $1.50 above equilibrium price. Therefore, price would have to fall by $1.50 in order to make consumers willing to buy the same quantity as before. If price falls down to $8.50, buyers are still willing to purchase 500 pizzas. A tax on buyers shifts the demand curve by the amount of the tax. The new equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the new demand curve and the original supply curve. The equilibrium quantity is 450 pizzas. The price sellers receive is $9.50, labeled PS. The price buyers pay is $11, labeled PB. The difference between the price received and the price paid is the size of the tax. The tax incidence is how the burden of the tax is shared among the market participants, the buyers and the sellers. In our example, the buyers pay $1 more compared to the original equilibrium, and sellers get 50 cents less than the original equilibrium. Let's look at the same market but see what happens if the tax is levied on sellers rather than buyers. The tax is still $1.50 per unit. In this case, the tax raises sellers' costs by $1.50 per pizza. Sellers will only supply 500 pizzas if the price rises to $11.50 to compensate for the increase in cost. A tax on the sellers will shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. The new equilibrium will occur at the intersection of the new supply curve and the original demand curve. The equilibrium quantity is 450 units. Buyers pay $11, labeled PB. The sellers receive $9.50, labeled PS. The difference between the amount paid and received is the size of the tax. You should notice that the outcome is the same in both cases. The effects on price and quantity and the tax incidence are the same whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. Buyers pay $11, sellers receive $9.50, and the quantity is 450. Buyers have $1.50 of the tax burden, and sellers have 50 cents of the tax burden. What matters is this: a tax drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. Let's finish the chapter by looking at how elasticity alters tax incidence. Suppose the supply curve is more elastic than demand. Notice that the supply curve is drawn relatively flatter than the demand curve. Remember, elastic means responsive. We can see where equilibrium price would be without the tax. A tax creates a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. If supply is more elastic, buyers' share of the tax burden is greater than the seller's share of the tax burden. This occurs because it's easier for sellers than buyers to leave the market. Suppose that demand is more elastic than supply. Notice that the demand curve is drawn relatively flatter than the supply curve. Remember, elastic means responsive. We can see where equilibrium price would be without the tax. A tax creates a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. If demand is more elastic, the buyer's share of the tax burden is less than the seller's share of the tax burden. This occurs because it is easier for the buyers than the sellers to leave the market. Here we have a simple demand and supply diagram. Equilibrium price without the tax is labeled PE, and equilibrium quantity without the tax is labeled QE. Suppose a per unit tax is levied and drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. Buyers now pay PB and sellers receive PS. The equilibrium quantity is labeled QT. Tax revenue is calculated by multiplying the tax by the quantity being sold and is shown as the pink shaded area. We are going to apply the concept of welfare economics developed in Chapter 7 to measure the gains and losses from a tax. We will determine consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, and total surplus with and without the tax. Remember, tax revenue can fund beneficial services, so we include it in total surplus. Services include things like public education, roads, and police. Without a tax, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. In this scenario, consumer surplus would be the area of A, B, C. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price. In this scenario, producer surplus would be the area of D, E, F. Total surplus is the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Therefore, total surplus is A, B, C, D, E, F. In this case, there is no tax, therefore tax revenue equals 0. With a tax, consumer surplus is going to be reduced. Consumer surplus is reduced only to area A. Producer surplus is reduced only to area F. Tax revenue is equal to the area of B plus D. Remember, tax revenue is added to total surplus since tax revenue pays for beneficial services. Total surplus is A, B, D, and F. The tax reduces consumer surplus by the area of C and producer surplus by the area of E. C and E are called deadweight loss, or DWL for short. Deadweight loss is the fall in total surplus that results from market distortion, such as a tax. Because of the tax, the units between QT and QE are not sold. The value of these units is greater than the cost of producing them, so the tax prevents some mutually beneficial trades. Deadweight loss is not the same on all goods. When the government is trying to decide which goods or services to tax, to raise the revenue it needs, they choose the goods and services with the smallest deadweight loss. Deadweight loss depends on the price elasticity of supply and the price elasticity of demand, which we discussed in Chapter 5. Remember, price elasticity of demand measures how much quantity demanded changes when prices change, and price elasticity of supply measures how much quantity supply changes when prices change. When supply is inelastic, the supply curve can be drawn relatively steep. Inelastic supply means that firms are relatively unresponsive to price changes, and it is harder for firms to leave the market when the price they receive is reduced due to the tax. The tax only reduces equilibrium quantity a little, so the deadweight loss is relatively small. When supply is elastic, the supply curve is drawn relatively flat. Elastic supply means firms are relatively responsive to price changes, and it is easier for firms to leave the market when the price they receive is reduced due to a tax. The tax causes equilibrium quantity to decrease much more, causing more deadweight loss. When demand is inelastic, the demand curve can be drawn relatively steep. Inelastic demand means that consumers are relatively unresponsive to price changes, and it is harder for them to leave the market when the tax causes the price they pay to increase. The tax causes equilibrium quantity to decrease a little, so the deadweight loss is relatively small. If demand is more elastic, the demand curve is drawn relatively flat. Elastic demand means that consumers are responsive to price changes and can easily leave the market when the tax causes the price they pay to increase. This reduces equilibrium quantity much more and creates more deadweight loss. The question arises about how big the government should be. A bigger government can provide more goods and services, but that requires higher taxes, which then cause more deadweight loss. A larger deadweight loss from taxation, the greater the argument for a smaller government. A tax on labor income is especially important since payroll taxes and income taxes are the biggest sources of government revenue. For the typical worker, the marginal tax rate is around 40%. The marginal tax rate refers to the tax on the last dollar of earnings. How big is the deadweight loss from this tax? Well, the answer depends on elasticity.